In the autumn of 1864, in a quiet village far removed from the battlefields of the Civil War, a child began to speak of a life she had never lived. Her words were not the babble of imagination, but precise details. Streets her family had never walked, names they had never heard, and a death she could not have witnessed. The villagers whispered that her voice carried the weight of something ancient, something that did not belong to her 6 fragile years. Some dismissed it as childish fancy, while others shuddered, sensing the uncanny truth that memory itself can be a haunting. This was not a ghost that visited from without. It was a ghost that had taken root within. What follows is not merely a story of superstition, but a descent into one of history's most disquieting mysteries, the girl who remembered a life she should never have known. Before the first whisper of the uncanny, life in rural America carried the deceptive stillness of routine. It was the mid-19th century, and though the Civil War raged in distant fields, not every village bore its smoke and thunder. In some pockets of the country, ordinary families clung tightly to familiar rhythms, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, and kneeling each Sunday on worn church pews. Theirs was a world held together by repetition, by the small certainties of bread baked, candles lit, and neighbors greeted at the well. The girl's family was no different. They were neither wealthy nor desperate, a household bound by modest respectability. Her father labored with the land, her mother tended to the domestic world with quiet precision, and the children played beneath trees whose roots had seen generations pass. Their home was simple but secure, marked by the scent of wood smoke and the creak of hand-carved floors. To those who passed by it was unremarkable, a family blending seamlessly into the unchanging fabric of their village. The town itself was a collection of plain dwellings set against rolling fields and forest edges. Chickens scratched in yards, blacksmiths hammered at their anvils, and the bell of the church marked time as faithfully as the turning seasons. Outsiders rarely came, and news from beyond arrived slow, folded within letters or murmured by travelers who drifted through. The war was spoken of, yes, but distantly, as though it belonged to another world entirely. What mattered most here was survival, community, and the sense of safety that came from knowing every face at every door. It was this backdrop of familiarity that made what followed so disturbing. For in such villages, the ordinary was sacred. Children were expected to mirror the innocence of their surroundings, to carry only the light burdens of play and prayer. When one of them spoke out of turn, not with mischief but with knowledge no child should have, the illusion of stability cracked. At first, the family had no reason to suspect their daughter's words might carry weight beyond imagination. She was a child among many, her laughter as bright as any other's. But the peace of their small world, the illusion of safety in a land already fractured by war, would not hold. What began as a gentle rhythm of life, marked by harvests, hymns, and hearthfires, would soon be shattered by a voice that did not seem to belong to the living present, but to something older, something carried across the veil of time itself. It began so quietly that no one marked the moment. The girl was no older than 6 when she first spoke of people her family had never known. She sat at the hearth one evening, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, and mentioned a woman named Eliza, who wore her hair in a braid and sang while tending a garden. Her mother, stirring the pot above the fire, merely smiled. Children invented companions when play grew dull. Yet when pressed, the girl described not just Eliza's face but the garden itself. Rows of herbs, a crooked fence, a chipped blue pitcher set by the door. None of these belonged to her own home. Days later, she began to speak of streets no villager recognized. She described them with an accuracy that startled, naming where the cobblestones dipped, where lamplight fell across windows, where a baker's shop stood with its sign shaped like a crescent moon. Her father, uneasy but practical, dismissed it as mimicry. Perhaps she had overheard travelers and absorbed their tales. But the details were not vague impressions. They were precise, mapped out as though she had walked them herself. What unsettled most was the way she lingered on names. Neighbors pressed her for stories, curious to see how far a child's imagination could stretch. She recited them calmly like a litany. Thomas, who limped when he walked. Margaret, who wore a green shawl. Samuel, whose laugh carried like a bell. Yet when the elders searched their memories, these were not figures of the present. They were names buried in the past, some belonging to villagers who had died decades earlier. The child had no means of knowing them. Her parents grew uneasy as the stories multiplied. She spoke not in vague daydreams but in sequences, recalling houses with red shutters, staircases that groaned in specific places, fields marked by weathered stones. When asked how she knew, she only frowned in confusion, as if the question itself was strange. "I remember," she said, her voice small but steady. "I have been there." At first the family kept her words private, fearful of mockery. But children repeat themselves, and soon others heard. A neighbor, shaken, confessed that the girl had described his grandmother's home in exact detail, though the house had been torn down before the girl was born. Another villager turned pale when she mentioned a pond where a boy had drowned long ago, an event never spoken of outside hushed circles. What began as innocent chatter shifted into something else entirely, testimony that could not be explained. The girl's laughter still rang like any child's, but her words bore the weight of places unseen and voices silenced by time. In a world that valued the predictable rhythm of life, her uncanny memories spread like cracks across glass, subtle at first but destined to widen until even the most faithful denied their own certainty. At first, her strangeness belonged only to waking hours, but soon it began to follow her into the night. The girl would wake gasping, whispering names in the dark, her small hands clutched against her chest as though she had been running. Her parents, startled from sleep, leaned close to catch the fragments of words. They were not the shapeless ramblings of a child half dreaming. They were precise, streets lit by lanterns, parlors draped in velvet, staircases winding into attics thick with dust. She spoke of lullabies she had never been taught, of prayers in accents foreign to her tongue. Each night the visions sharpened. She described the weight of another mother's hand resting on her shoulder, the scent of bread cooling on windowsills, the creak of wooden doors that no longer existed in her own home. One dream ended with the echo of gunfire, another with water rushing over her head, another still with a burial, her own, where she felt the soil pressing down as though memory itself had weight. By morning she recounted these scenes with unnerving clarity, her eyes wide, her voice steady, as if she had lived them rather than merely imagined them. Her father, skeptical but unsettled, began writing her words down. He filled pages with her accounts, dates, and places. To his growing unease, he noticed that her tales carried coherence, not the scattered fragments of invention. She returned to the same streets, the same people, the same endings again and again. A pattern revealed itself. She was not spinning stories anew each night. She was continuing one story, piece by piece across many dreams. One evening, her mother took the notes to the village pastor, hoping to ease her fear. He frowned, flipping through the entries, and stopped when the girl's description aligned with a neighboring town 2 days' ride away. The name of its main street, the design of its church, even the initials carved into a particular oak tree by its entrance, each matched with eerie precision. When questioned, the girl insisted she had never been there in this life, but that she remembered it all the same. The dreams began to haunt more than her family. A local farmer, listening with pale face, admitted that her account of a woman collapsing during childbirth matched the story of his own mother's death, something he had not shared beyond his household. Another villager, trembling, claimed she described a fire that had consumed his uncle's mill 30 years earlier, down to the crack in the bell that tolled during the blaze. What once seemed like childish invention now pressed against the boundaries of reason. Her nights bled into her days, and with them came a chilling certainty. These were not dreams, not fancies, but fragments of another existence clawing their way back into the present. And each morning, as she awoke and spoke them aloud, the line between her life and the life remembered grew thinner, until the two felt dangerously close to merging. It was one thing for her family to hear the girl speak of places she had never seen, but it became something altogether darker when her words began to spill into the streets. Neighbors stopped at the fence to listen, some crossing themselves as she described in chilling detail events that predated her own birth. The whispers spread quickly, seeping into every corner of the village. Soon everyone seemed to know of the child who carried 2 lives in one small body. The local pastor was the first to speak with authority. He warned her parents that such unnatural knowledge was a snare of the devil. Children, he said, were innocent vessels, but demons often chose the purest to twist. To him, The girl's memories were not echoes of another life, but whispers from hell itself. He urged prayer, fasting, and even considered the possibility of exorcism. Yet not all shared his certainty. Among the older women of the village, keepers of tales of charms passed down from grandmothers, there was another interpretation. They whispered of soul return, of spirits born again into the flesh. Their grandmothers had spoken of such things long before the preacher's arrival, stories tucked into fireside evenings and hushed conversations. To them, the girl was not cursed but marked, a rare vessel of something beyond death. The debate carved the village in two. At the tavern, men argued late into the night. Was she a trickster, fed details in secret to stir attention? Or was she proof of something that rattled the very bones of Christian teaching? Some claimed to test her. One farmer asked her to name the residents of a town 3 valleys away, a place she had never visited. Without hesitation, she recited not only names, but the shape of the church spire, the bend of the river, and the story of a woman who had drowned there years before. The farmer returned home pale, unwilling to speak of what he had heard. Fear deepened. Mothers pulled their children closer, warning them not to play near her. Yet fascination ran just as strong. People who once would never have spoken to her family now crowded their doorway, hungry for the next impossible detail. The girl's words had become both a threat and a lure, something villagers dreaded and could not resist. Her parents, torn between shame and wonder, found themselves caught in the middle of a struggle larger than their household. To side with the pastor was to admit their daughter might be damned. To listen to the old women was to risk blasphemy. And so they did what so many do when faced with the unexplainable. They wavered, afraid to choose, afraid not to. It was in this uncertainty, in this quiet war of belief and fear, that the child's presence grew even more haunting. For every word she spoke threatened to topple one world of certainty and replace it with another darker one. The village no longer whispered in corners. It demanded answers. The girl, once a figure of quiet unease, now stood at the center of a storm. In the parish hall, its wooden beams groaning like weary witnesses, the townsfolk gathered. Candles sputtered, their flames bending as though reluctant to illuminate what was about to unfold. On one side sat the skeptics, stern men of commerce, scholars clinging to reason, and priests armed with scripture. On the other, the believers, farmers, widows, and mothers, who had seen too much to dismiss what lingered in the shadows. Between them, the child, her gaze steady, neither fearful nor proud. Questions rained down. What did she know of the manor 3 valleys over? Could she describe the fresco on its chapel wall? She spoke not haltingly, but with unnerving confidence. Her words painted images too precise for chance. The curling vines etched in faded pigment, the chipped halo above a saint's head, the damp scent of stone corridors that few outsiders had walked. Murmurs rippled across the crowd. One skeptic scribbled furiously, desperate to catch an inconsistency, yet none appeared. Then the inquiries grew bolder, darker. "Describe the blacksmith's brother," one man challenged, thinking the girl cornered. She answered with chilling detail. The limp in his left foot, the scar across his shoulder, the secret habit of leaving coins beneath the church pew when no one watched. Gasps tore through the room. The blacksmith's face drained of color. The secret was his alone. Or so he believed. What followed was not a trial in the legal sense, but it carried the same weight. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward, daring her to expose what only they knew. And she did. Family feuds hidden for generations, infidelities buried beneath polite smiles, losses mourned in silence, known only to a locked drawer or a midnight prayer. The truth, raw and merciless, spilled from her lips as though she had lived each life herself. Fear swelled in the air, thick enough to choke. Some declared her blessed, a vessel chosen to unveil divine mysteries. Others hissed that she was possessed, her knowledge the poison of demons. The clergy pressed harder, their voices rising in cadence, scripture clashing against her calm. Yet still she spoke, her tone unbroken, her eyes distant, as though she were not inventing but remembering. By night's end, the hall felt less like a gathering and more like a tomb. Skeptics had no answers, believers no peace. The girl remained an enigma, untouched by their fury or awe. When she was finally led away, the crowd did not cheer nor curse. They sat in silence, haunted by the echoes of truths they had never wanted spoken aloud. For the first time, doubt no longer separated skeptic from believer. Both sides shared the same gnawing terror, that the child's words were not tricks, not fantasies, but fragments of something older, something that defied the boundary between the living and the dead. The morning broke grey and silent, as though the sky itself held its breath. A small procession wound along the dirt road toward the neighboring town, priests muttering prayers, townsfolk craning their necks, and at the center, the girl who carried the weight of two identities. She walked without hesitation, her bare feet finding the path as if retracing steps worn in another lifetime. The first landmark appeared sooner than expected. She stopped before a leaning oak, its bark split by lightning years prior. "Here," she said softly, touching the scarred wood. Those who had lived in the town confirmed it had struck during a storm decades ago, remembered by few. Unease rippled through the crowd, yet she moved on, pointing out wells, doorways, and stones in the road, as if they were chapters in a book only she could read. When they reached the cemetery, her pace slowed. The iron gate groaned open, and she threaded through the rows with unwavering certainty. Her hand brushed across one headstone, then another, until she stopped before a modest marker overgrown with ivy. "This was my bed," she whispered, the words chilling in their simplicity. Some recoiled, crossing themselves. Others pressed closer, desperate to see what she would reveal next. At last they reached the home of a grieving family, a mother, father, and brother who had buried their daughter years before. Their faces, hollowed by memory, studied the child who now stood in their threshold. She spoke before they could ask. She described the bedroom, the faded quilt with patches of blue, the wooden doll missing an arm, the way the window let in a sliver of moonlight on restless nights. Every detail was precise, intimate, and undeniable. The mother trembled, tears cutting paths down her cheeks. The father's jaw clenched, torn between disbelief and aching hope. The brother, older now, went pale when she recounted a secret. The carved initials hidden beneath the barn beams, a childhood pact meant never to be discovered. The boy had carved them with his sister, and no one else had ever known. The room swelled with grief and dread. Was this reunion a miracle or a cruel trick? The girl did not plead her case, nor did she boast. She merely recited memories with a quiet certainty, as if the soul within her was trying to find its way home. Some onlookers wept openly, moved by the apparent resurrection of a lost child. Others recoiled, whispering that such knowledge could not come from God. For the family, the revelation was both gift and torment, confirmation that their daughter's spirit lingered, but trapped in a body that was not hers. As dusk fell, the town no longer debated whether the girl's knowledge was real. Instead, a more terrifying question settled over them. If death could not sever memory, what else might linger in the fragile boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond? The days that followed blurred into a haze of dread. Inside their modest home, her parents sat in silence more often than they spoke, their gazes heavy with questions they dared not voice aloud. To protect their daughter meant drawing her close, yet every time she uttered another fragment from a life not hers, they recoiled as though from a stranger wearing a familiar face. The warmth of kinship clashed with a creeping terror. What if she was no longer entirely their child? Beyond their door, the village festered with division. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, their whispers sharp as knives. Some claimed the girl was a miracle, living proof that the soul endured beyond the grave. They brought offerings, trinkets, and prayers, treating her as if she were a vessel of revelation. Others spat at her shadow, muttering that she was marked, that her presence courted ruin. To them she was not a child but an omen, sent to unravel the natural order. The church bell tolled heavier than before, its echoes suffused with unease. The clergy condemned her publicly, warning that to accept her visions was to flirt with heresy. Yet in private, even priests faltered, their faith shaken by the details she revealed, truths that no child should have known. In the taverns, men drank harder, telling stories of witches, demons, and restless spirits who stole the breath of the living. By lantern light, mothers pulled their children inside, latching windows against the girl who seemed to walk with the dead. Her parents found themselves trapped in a paradox. To shelter her meant defying the tide of fear swelling against their family. To denounce her meant betraying the very blood that bound them together. Each night they lay awake listening to her soft murmurs in sleep, words in voices that were not her own. It was as if the walls of their home had become thin, fragile membranes where two worlds pressed against one another, threatening to collapse. The girl herself seemed caught in the fracture. At times she played and laughed as any child might, her innocence briefly reclaiming her body. Yet a moment later, her eyes would darken with the weight of memory, describing places she had never stood in this life, people whose names had long been carved into stone. To her there was no boundary between past and present, only a cruel merging that others called impossible, and so the town split, each faction feeding on fear. Some clung to her as salvation, others called for her removal. Families argued across dinner tables, friends turned cold in the streets, and the once stable rhythm of daily life decayed. It was not just the girl who seemed fractured, it was the fabric of reality itself. For if a child could speak with the certainty of the dead, then what else might be waiting, unseen just beyond the veil? Time, as it always does, began to erode what once felt unshakable. The girl, once a vessel of chilling certainty, found her memories slipping like water through open fingers. Faces once described with painful clarity, blurred into vagueness. Streets she had drawn with uncanny precision, now twisted into confusion. What she once declared without hesitation began to falter under the weight of years. It was as though the other life that had consumed her childhood was dissolving, retreating back into the shadows from which it had come. Yet the fading of her recollections did little to ease the unease that had already settled into the bones of the town. For the family whose dead child she had mirrored, the wound never healed. They could not look upon her without seeing the face of the daughter they had lost. Her laughter reminded them, her mannerisms haunted them, even as her certainty began to dim. When she grew uncertain, they did not. To them she would forever be a living echo of the life taken from them too soon. Her parents, meanwhile, lived with scars invisible to the eye. They had raised her through whispers of possession, through accusations of witchcraft, through the unnerving belief that their daughter carried two souls inside her fragile body. Now, as the fire of her visions dimmed, they were left with questions that gnawed endlessly. Had it all been real, or had it been madness they had mistaken for truth? The doubt was almost worse than belief. The town, too, refused to let go. The story became a current beneath ordinary life, retold in taverns and around fireplaces, a cautionary tale to frighten children into silence. Some spoke of her as a miracle, others as a warning. As seasons passed, her name was invoked in both prayer and curse, and though she grew into adolescence and then into adulthood, her childhood self remained trapped in folklore, frozen as the strange girl who remembered what no one should. She herself tried to move forward. She learned to weave her fading memories into something she could almost dismiss, like dreams that lingered in fragments but lost their sharp edges. Yet there were moments, sudden and piercing, when a smell, a sound, or a turn of light would drag her back. The echo of another life stirred within her chest, faint but undeniable. It reminded her, and all who knew her, that the past she carried was not entirely gone. It lingered, like a ghost refusing to depart, and so the story never ended. Though her memories grew dim, though her certainty wavered, the legend remained. It lived not just in her, but in the people around her, in the grief of one family, the fear of another, and the whispered traditions of a town forever changed. What began as the strange words of a child had grown into something much larger, a haunting no one could fully explain, and no one could truly forget. The story endures not because it was solved, but because it never was. A child's voice, once filled with certainty, now drifts through history like an echo across a canyon. Was she a miracle, or a mirror reflecting the fears and desires of a community desperate to believe in something beyond the grave? No testimony, no scripture, no rational inquiry could untangle the knot she left behind. And so her life became less about who she truly was and more about what she represented, a fracture in the veil between this world and the next. To the faithful she was a sign, proof that the soul does not end with the body but lingers, searching for passage. To the fearful she was a warning, evidence that evil could wear the face of innocence. For her parents she was both blessing and burden, cherished child and uninvited mystery. They had wanted nothing more than a simple life, yet found themselves guardians of a story that refused to remain ordinary. The town never forgot. Even as generations passed, the tale of the girl who remembered another life was whispered into new ears, retold with the solemnity of Scripture and the tremor of a ghost story. Some swore she was touched by heaven, others whispered of witchcraft, and still others claimed she was the embodiment of memory itself. But the truth, if such a thing exists, remains buried in silence. In the end, the most haunting image is the simplest one: a child standing at the threshold of two lives, her small frame carrying the unbearable weight of both. Her innocence became the stage upon which belief and dread collided, and the echoes of that collision linger still. History offers no resolution, only a question that deepens with retelling. Was she a vessel of reincarnation or a vessel of fear? Perhaps the line was never meant to be clear. Perhaps the terror lies in the uncertainty, in knowing that the human mind, when confronted with mystery, creates stories as much as it uncovers them. The girl fades into time, yet her shadow endures, leaving us to wonder not only about her life, but about our own. After all, what is memory, if not the ghost we each carry within us?